Few in Oakstone Hills knew much about the man who moved into the broken ranch at the edge of the valley. They saw the moving truck, watched as a flatbed hauled in fencing and steel gates, but he never introduced himself. Not once. No HOA meetings, no casual greetings. No response to the welcome packet slid under his door. Just quiet work, sunrise to sundown, and one massive gate that stayed locked. Karen didn't like that. She ran the HOA like a stage play. And every house in Oakstone was expected to perform. Lawns trimmed, shutters painted, holiday flags aligned by regulation. But that man's land. It wasn't part of the script. He didn't prune the thorn brush along the shared fence. His soil bled into wildflower, and most offensive of all his animals weren't listed. Karen saw them once, a row of bulls standing beneath a ridge, watching as she walked her schnauzer along the trail. They were big, thick-horned, black coats glinting like obsidian under the sun. One had gold tags on its ears. Another had a visible ankle monitor, not the kind for livestock, something more advanced, something monitored. She filed a complaint that night. Unregistered cattle and invasive livestock roaming too close to community trails, she wrote. She suggested he be fined, suggested he remove the bulls and clear the brush or face HOA corrective action. He didn't respond. 2 weeks passed. Then a drone appeared over the ridge. Not a toy. Something with range and thermal sensors. It hovered each morning, circling the herd. It captured motion, wind patterns, heat signatures, and then it vanished, leaving only the faint hum of lawfully recorded evidence. Karen was tired of being ignored. She printed photos of the brush, snapped images of the bulls from a distance, and called in a favor. Her cousin, a former hunting club president, said the area was overgrown, dangerous, even said those bulls weren't standard ranch stock, they looked feral, maybe hybrids. That was all the justification Karen needed. She walked into the HOA meeting that night with a folder, waved off the other agenda items, and said, "We have a wildlife hazard developing behind Lot 39. The board was half asleep. No, one objected. She never said the land wasn't under HOA jurisdiction. She never mentioned the title change filed 4 months earlier that redrew the boundary line. She never admitted the bulls had protected status. She didn't ask questions. Instead, she made a call. 3 days later, 3 trucks arrived. Each held a man wearing camo and scopes. They parked outside the gate just before dawn. Karen was there to greet them, keys in hand. Motioning toward the field with a smile like she'd just given them front row tickets to a private show. She told them to stay low. She told them to shoot if they saw anything large and moving near the ridge. She laughed when one asked, "Are you sure about this?" "They're just wild bulls," she said. Nothing special. But 50 yards away, deep in the brush, Jackson Crow sat behind a wall of display monitors. He didn't smile. He didn't blink. The bulls were already aware. The sensors were armed. And the moment that first boot touched his soil, the entire system lit up red. The hunt had begun, but not the one they were expecting. The sun was still crawling over the horizon when the hunters moved past the main fence. The land beyond wasn't flat, it rose and fell in uneven waves of knee-high grass, and brush dotted with sharp stone. Nothing marked the boundary. There was no sign, no post, nothing visible to the eye. But the land knew. Each boot that crossed the imaginary threshold triggered a silent pulse. Thin sensors buried 6 inches below the dirt mapped every step. One of the bulls shifted on the ridge. Another stared directly through the tall brush as if it could see the glint of rifles approaching. Karen stood outside the gate with her arms crossed. She didn't enter. She didn't want dirt on her shoes, didn't want to sweat. Her job, she believed, was already done. Inside the property, the lead hunter paused. "This doesn't feel right," he muttered. "Why?" one of the others asked. "Look at their spacing. The bulls. They're watching in formation. Don't be dramatic. They're cattle." But they weren't. Jackson watched from the ranch house. He had not slept. He didn't need to. His system was designed for this. The bulls were part of a 5-year breeding and training program sponsored by a federal biodiversity agency. Each one was equipped with a geotag tracker and behavioral responder, part of an endangered heritage line preserved from genetic erosion. Not one had ever been sold. Not one had ever been harmed. Their breed's recovery was a national project and Jackson had been entrusted to protect it. He zoomed in on the hunters' rifles. He tracked their movement by heat map. The drone moved into position, quietly gliding above the second truck. Cameras locked. Microphones engaged. Then a mistake happened. One of the hunters spotted a horn above the grass, panicked, and shouted, "Target, right!" The rifle was raised, finger on the trigger. In less than 1 second, the drone issued a series of warning clicks. The closest bull stomped once and lowered its head, the gold tag flashing. The hunter hesitated, confused. Then came a voice, loud, commanding, from hidden speakers, buried near the oak tree line. "You are trespassing on federally protected land. Cease movement. Disarm immediately. You are being recorded." The hunters froze. Karen, still outside the gate, tilted her head when she heard the faint static of the announcement echo over the hill. She didn't recognize the voice. But she knew authority when she heard it. She tried to call the hunters, but the signal dropped. Back on the property, the bulls had encircled the field, slowly, silently, not charging, just standing. One moved into full view, towering and immobile, eyes fixed on the man with the raised rifle. The second hunter spoke first. "That's no farm bull. That's something else." Then the sound of a truck engine. Not there's an unmarked SUV rolled down the gravel path leading to the back road. 2 agents stepped out, wearing dark windbreakers with no local insignia. They carried no weapons, only documents. The hunters stepped back, lowering their rifles, realizing too late they had walked into something far more complex than a morning hunt. And Karen, she saw the SUV arrive. She backed away from the gate, confused, searching for a way to explain, but the gate had auto-locked. Her access was denied. Inside the house, Jackson took a sip of coffee. The alert on his screen confirmed everything had been uploaded. Satellite backup complete. Audio archived. Drone synced to agency cloud. He closed the laptop and whispered under his breath, "They always underestimate the quiet ones." The SUV came to a full stop just beyond the gate. Its tires crunched the gravel in a rhythm that pierced the morning calm. Karen froze where she stood. She hadn't expected anyone official. Not this early. Not without a courtesy call. Her face tightened, unsure whether to wave or retreat. The passenger door opened first. A man in his late 40s stepped out, tall, lean, holding a leather folder. He said nothing, only glanced at the drone, still hovering. The other agent, a woman with sharp eyes and a badge clipped to her belt, opened the gate with a code. Not an HOA code, something federal. Karen took a step forward. "Excuse me, this is private property," she began, her voice climbing with forced authority. "Who exactly are you?" The male agent turned his head toward her, calmly. "We're with the Department of Agricultural Enforcement. Division 7. Karen blinked. "Agricultural. What?" The woman held up a printed photo, one of the bulls standing in front of a motion sensor. "These animals are federally documented heritage stock under a National Genetic Preservation Act," she said, her tone clipped. "They're not cows. They're not livestock. They are categorized as biologically protected specimens. Which makes this," she gestured toward the armed men inside, "a violation of federal conservation law." Karen scoffed. "They're just bulls. Feral bulls. The community's at risk. I had every right to." "You had no right," the male agent interrupted, his tone still even. "You are not the landowner. This field is privately owned and legally registered as a protected habitat under federal jurisdiction. You authorized, unauthorized entry with firearms onto that property." Karen's lips moved but no sound came out. Inside the brush, the hunters stood still, hands off their weapons. They could hear everything. The agent's voice carried through the open field, calm and clear. One of them whispered, "We've been set up." "No," the other replied, shaking his head. "We were lied to." The lead hunter removed his cap and stepped forward, toward the agents. "I'm calling it," he said. "We're pulling out." But it was already too late. Jackson emerged from the shadows of the tree line, walking casually down the ridge. The bulls parted slightly to let him through. His boots were coated in dust, his shirt rolled at the sleeves, and in his hand, he held a small black remote, the kind that looked ordinary but carried quiet power. He nodded once to the agents, then stopped in front of the hunters. "You're trespassing," he said simply. One of the men opened his mouth to speak, but Jackson raised a hand. "Not interested in explanations. Everything you said, everything you did, is already recorded and time-stamped." Karen rushed forward now, trying to salvage what little control she had left. "This was a misunderstanding," she insisted, voice trembling. "These men came to help. You never responded to my reports." Jackson turned his eyes toward her, calm, cold. You called in hunters with rifles onto protected federal stock and opened a gate you had no authority over. That's not a misunderstanding. That's a federal offense. The woman agent stepped between them. You'll receive formal notification of investigation within 48 hours, she told Karen. For now, do not contact the landowner, do not attempt to access this property again, and do not interfere with the ongoing federal review. Karen's voice cracked. You can't be serious. I'm on the HOA board. Jackson let out a short breath. Not quite a laugh. And that means what? Exactly. Out here, your rules end at the fence. You passed that line. Now we'll see what your title's really worth. The drone clicked once overhead. Another file, locked. Another layer of evidence sealed. The game had shifted, and Karen no longer knew the rules. By the following evening, the HOA boardroom was packed. Folding chairs scraped across the tile. Phones buzzed with messages that no one answered. Karen sat stiffly at the head of the table, her expression pinched and cold. She hadn't spoken since entering, just stared at the printed notice the agents had handed her, pending federal investigation, unauthorized access to protected conservation zone. The rest of the board sat in tense silence, their eyes shifting between the door and the digital screen already set up in front of them. Karen had called for an emergency session, but the panic didn't start until they received the same drone footage Jackson had filed with the federal office. Footage the HOA was legally required to review as part of the official complaint. Then, the screen flickered to life. It began quietly. Audio from a microphone hidden in the grass played Karen's voice with haunting clarity. They're just wild bulls. If you see one, shoot it. No one's going to care. Then came the footage, thermal imaging of the hunters crossing the boundary, overlaid with geolocation markers. One scene showed a hunter raising his rifle directly at a tagged bull. Another captured Karen smiling as she waved them through the gate. No one spoke. Not even the treasurer, who usually had something clever to say about everything. Finally, the board president cleared his throat. Karen, did you get authorization for this? For anything? Karen lifted her chin, but the strain was visible. I submitted a hazard report. It was ignored. I acted to protect the community. Another member leaned forward. You invited armed men to private property? Property we no longer manage. You knew that. The boundary was redrawn in January. I didn't see the update, Karen said tightly. You signed the update, someone whispered. The silence returned. Only the hum of the projector filled the air. Then came the final scene, Jackson stepping from the trees, bulls flanking him like sentinels, and the agents confronting the hunters with badges raised. That was the moment when reality finally sank in. The board president turned to the attorney seated near the back. Can the HOA be held liable for this? The attorney adjusted his glasses. If it can be proven, the HOA representative acted outside their authority, liability could fall solely on her. But if there's any suggestion that her actions were sanctioned or ignored by the board, then yes, we're exposed. Karen snapped. I did what none of you would do. I acted. That man was ignoring regulations. His animals were dangerous. They're a federally protected species. The secretary cut in. This isn't about lawn height or mailbox design. You trespassed on conservation land and invited hunters with weapons. You think that's going to disappear with a signature? The room fractured into whispers. Some leaned away from Karen. Others quietly gathered their notes, avoiding eye contact. A board vote was already forming and spoken, inevitable. Karen's hands curled around the edges of her folder. You're all cowards, she hissed. You let him take over the edge of this community, and said nothing. The vice president stood. He didn't take anything. He bought that land legally. What you did was start a war over a fence you never owned. Karen rose, eyes burning. You're siding with him? No, the president said calmly. We're siding with the law. He looked to the others. Motioned to suspend Karen's voting privileges and initiate a formal censure pending legal review. The hands rose, one by one. Karen stood alone as the vote passed, quiet, final, and without ceremony. Outside, a low growl echoed in the distance. One of Jackson's bulls stood just beyond the ridge, watching from behind the new steel fence line. The land remembered, and now, so would the HOA. 2 mornings later, a thick white envelope landed on the HOA's office desk. No return address. No logo, just a wax seal stamped with a symbol no one recognized. The receptionist placed it in the board president's inbox, unsure whether to open it. By noon, it had already made its way into a dozen hands. By 1 p.m., it had reached Karen's. She tore it open. Inside was a letterhead printed on textured parchment. The signature at the bottom was unmistakable. Jackson Crow, attorney at law, retired, specialist in federal conservation law. It wasn't a threat, it was a declaration. In exact detail, it listed the bulls by genetic designation, location, federal, tag number, and preservation status. 6 bulls had been endangered by the intrusion. 3 had their behavioral monitors triggered by proximity alarms. 1 had been actively targeted with a scoped rifle. Each violation, according to the cited code, carried a base fine of $250,000 per incident. Per annum, the total demand was $1.5 million in civil damages. Karen's hands trembled. Below the list, Jackson had added a line in calm, measured text. This figure does not yet account for emotional stress to the herd, interference with scheduled breeding cycles, or long-term behavioral disruption categories, which carry additional weight under the Preservation Act. At the bottom, he'd left a phone number. Not for settlement. For service of process. The board gathered again that evening. The president read the letter aloud. The silence afterward was thicker than before. No one laughed. No one rolled their eyes. The treasurer spoke up first. He's not bluffing. The secretary nodded. Everything he cited is verifiable. Those bulls are real assets. Protected ones. And we now have recorded footage of our board of Karen facilitating an illegal incursion onto his land. Karen leaned forward, voice sharp. I didn't do this as the board. I acted as a neighbor. You signed forms as a board representative. The attorney cut in. You used your title. You entered the property and opened a gate that legally belonged to someone else. You identified the animals as a threat without proper wildlife classification. That's not just a civil problem. That borders on criminal negligence. Karen stood up, her chair scraping hard against the floor. He's manipulating you all. He set a trap. He's not even part of this community. No, the vice president said coldly, but his land borders us. And now his lawyers are surrounding us. And thanks to you, we have no defense. The treasurer flipped the last page of the letter. He's given us one out. He'll consider a reduced settlement if the board agrees to take immediate action. Karen narrowed her eyes. What action? The room quieted. Then the president answered. Your removal, full removal from the HOA, and a public apology, in writing, signed by every board member, including you. Karen's face flushed deep red. He can't make us do that. He doesn't need to, the secretary whispered. He's already won. He's just offering a cheaper exit. Karen turned, her chest heaving. You're all afraid of him. No, the attorney said quietly. We're afraid of the law he already wrote. The projector screen lit up again this time, showing Jackson not through drone footage, but from a recorded statement. .com, precise. Every word chosen like a scalpel. You allowed armed intruders onto a conservation site under your jurisdiction. You endangered protected species under federal guardianship. I am not seeking vengeance. I'm seeking accountability. Then the screen faded to black dot. The vote wasn't even close. Karen's removal passed unanimously. She stormed out before the count finished. Outside the HOA office, a new sign had been hammered into the grass. Private property conservation site under federal observation. And just past it, one of the bulls stood at the crest of the hill, unmoving. Watching. By the end of the week, the damage had evolved from a letter into a legal storm. Every board member received a packet certified, thick, and unmistakably serious. The HOA itself had been named in a federal complaint. The heading was chilling in its precision. Petition for conservation damages and intentional endangerment filed in United States District Court. No one had expected Jackson to move this fast. No one had expected he'd skip local channels entirely. But now, the matter wasn't confined to Oakstone Hills. It had landed in a courthouse that rarely handled anything less than corporate violations or environmental disasters. The board convened in panic. Their lawyer was already on the line when the meeting started. This isn't a negotiation anymore, he said bluntly. You're not dealing with a neighbor. You're up against a man who used to prosecute land abuse for the government. His filings are airtight. Every document is timestamped. Every bull is registered and GPS logged. This case is already drawing attention in conservation circles. The treasurer asked the only question that mattered. What happens if we lose? The answer was silence at first. Then you won't just pay fines, the attorney said. You'll be forced to pay federal damages, relinquish jurisdiction over adjacent land parcels, and possibly face criminal review for enabling armed trespass. The HOA could be dissolved. The room fell quiet. Even those who had once sided with Karen now looked pale. At the far end of the table, the secretary clicked her pen and spoke carefully. "And what about him?" she asked. "Jackson. What's he really trying to do?" That question hung longer than anyone wanted, because no one had a clear answer. But the answer came that evening. Across the field on the ridge near Jackson's ranch, a small gathering began to take shape. Trucks from local news stations parked outside the old gravel road. A podium had been set up under the open sky. A handful of reporters stepped out, joined by 2 agents from the Department of Agricultural Enforcement. Cameras were fixed on one Mun Jackson Crow, dressed not in ranch clothes, but in a dark suit that hadn't seen dust in years. He stepped to the podium and adjusted the microphone. "I've spent the last decade working in silence to preserve what little of this country's heritage stock remains. These bulls are not just animals. They are living symbols of a breed that nearly vanished. This land is not just mine, it is their sanctuary." The camera panned to the bulls behind him, standing quietly like statues along the ridge. "A week ago," Jackson continued, "armed intruders crossed onto my property. They were not thieves. They were not poachers. They were invited by a local HOA board member who acted under false authority." He paused, his voice steady. "This is no longer about fences or overgrown brush. This is about accountability. About the arrogance of systems that believe titles grant ownership of everything they see." The next day, headlines spread like wildfire. "Retired federal lawyer sues HOA for endangering protected bulls, Oakstone Hills faces dissolution over conservation lawsuit, conservation bulls nearly shot by HOA invited hunters." Now a federal case inside Oakstone Hills. Residents began asking questions. A petition to review the HOA charter circulated. Several homes removed their community flags. The air shifted, and then came the most shocking move. Jackson filed a motion with the court to acquire the adjacent HOA land as part of the settlement offering, to buy out all unclaimed Greenbelt property and manage it as an extended conservation buffer. If granted, he wouldn't just border the HOA, he would surround it. The board stared at the new documents in disbelief. "He's not suing us to punish us," the vice president whispered. "He's suing us to absorb us." Outside, under the clouds, the bulls moved as one down the ridge, silent, steady, unstoppable. The HOA boardroom, once the polished center of control, had become a bunker of blame. The long mahogany table was now buried under paperwork, emergency petitions, legal responses, internal memos from insurance providers trying to distance themselves from the case. The office printer had died 2 days earlier, overloaded by the volume of federal notices. Nobody laughed anymore. Not even the treasurer. Rumors of Jackson's land acquisition motion had spread beyond Oakstone Hills. Local media now camped outside the neighborhood gates, asking homeowners if they felt betrayed by their own HOA, residents who once waved flags and lawn signs in favor of strict enforcement now ducked cameras and refused to speak. The board president looked 10 years older. His voice, once sure and commanding, cracked when he spoke. "We've lost confidence," he said, barely louder than a whisper. "The neighborhood is no longer backing us. They're preparing a vote to disband the entire board." "And what happens if we dissolve?" the secretary asked. "The lawsuit doesn't vanish." "No," the lawyer replied, grim, "but it means no one's left to defend it." He handed out another set of documents. Jackson had revised his motion. Instead of just acquiring the surrounding land, he now sought full administrative control over the Greenbelt and the trail systems, citing irresponsible neighborhood oversight as the justification. In plain terms, he wanted to govern what had once been theirs. The room sat in stunned quiet, but not for long. Someone knocked at the door. It was the sheriff's office. 2 deputies entered, calm and quiet, holding a county order. It wasn't an arrest. Not yet. But it was a summons served to Karen Mitchell, former board chair. She was now officially under investigation for unlawful access to restricted property, false designation of authority, and endangerment of federally protected species. Karen wasn't at the meeting. She hadn't returned since her removal. Her house was now guarded by privacy screens, her car unmoved in days. She hadn't spoken publicly, and no one had heard from her husband since the news broke. But the summons was real, and with it came a deadline. Failure to appear will escalate the charge, the deputy said, and if she ignores it, a warrant follows. The secretary exhaled slowly. So it's real now. It was real the moment she opened that gate, the vice president replied. That night, a neighborhood meeting was held in the community gymnasium. Over 70 residents showed up. Most had never attended a board meeting before. They came holding petitions, waving signed forms, demanding a vote, and they got it. In a matter of hours, the entire HOA board was stripped of authority. A temporary neighborhood council was formed, one whose sole job was to respond to the lawsuit and negotiate a resolution. But Jackson had anticipated that. The next morning, the new acting chair received a package inside, a single letter and a small metal tag. One of the bull's identifiers. The letter read, "This animal now recognizes change. He will not forget who opened the gate, nor who tried to rebuild it. But he may forgive, if given reason." There was no threat, no demand. Just acknowledgement. Karen was spotted that same evening, standing at the edge of her backyard, staring across the field toward the distant ridge. One of the bulls stood alone on the horizon, its eyes catching the porch light, UNMOVING. No words passed between them, but the silence said everything. The ridge no longer belonged to Oakstone Hills. It never truly had. It belonged to something older, something watching, something that remembered. 3 weeks after the neighborhood collapsed into legal chaos, a quiet stillness settled over Oakstone Hills. Yards remained trimmed, but no one smiled over hedges anymore. The flags that once flew from porch posts had vanished. HOA signs had been removed or painted over. The entrance fountain, once lit at night, now sat dry and silent. Everyone waited. The federal court had not yet ruled. But Jackson's latest move had caught the community off guard. It wasn't another lawsuit. It wasn't even a demand, it was a purchase. Title transfer records confirmed it. Jackson Crow had acquired the entire greenbelt, every trail system, every stretch of land once managed by the HOA, through quiet negotiations, with former lot owners who held rights to portions of the shared spaces. Jackson had stitched together a corridor of land that now encircled Oakstone Hills like a noose. The HOA no longer existed, and now, the neighborhood had no jurisdiction beyond its streets. Residents woke to new signs, nailed to fence posts around the perimeter. Conservation boundary federally registered. No entry without clearance. Heritage land protected, under National Genetic Act 6.3. This area is observed. Trespassers will be prosecuted. No logo, no HOA branding. Just law. Karen's house had gone up for sale days earlier, but no one showed up for the open house. Word had spread that her name was being used in conservation training as a cautionary example. No one wanted to live where her shadow still lingered. She left early one morning, driving away with the trunk packed and her blinds still drawn. No farewell, just silence. But Jackson didn't celebrate. He was seen one last time on the ridge alone, without a drone or monitor, walking among the bulls. A document was tucked beneath his arm, folded neatly, at the highest point of the ridge, where the wind scraped the dust into thin spirals. He drove a new post into the soil and mounted the document behind glass. Later that week, a hiker passing by paused at the sign and read the words written by hand. The ones who walked slowest remembered the most. They watched the intruders, they felt the breach, and they stood still, but they never struck. Not because they couldn't, but because they waited for the land to decide. And the land always does. J. Crow, the final court ruling never came. Jackson withdrew the federal suit. There was no need for it anymore. The land had already changed hands, not through war, but through patience. Months passed. Then came a change no one predicted. Jackson hosted a local conservation walk. Quietly, no flyers, no signs, just an open gate and a slow trail marked with simple posts showing heritage facts and dates. He walked at the front. The bulls grazed along the distance, visible but uninterested. Residents came, slowly, hesitantly. Some brought children, some carried shame. None of them spoke of the HOA. When the walk ended, Jackson turned to the group and said only this: "You don't have to control land to protect it. You just have to respect where you stand." Then he walked away, vanishing back into the trees. To this day, the field never saw another hunter. The bulls remained, the gate stayed closed, and the land, once dismissed as wild and useless, was now listed in the National Heritage Registry under a new name, Crow's Hollow Conservation Zone, #1175. It sits just beyond what used to be Oakstone Hills. And every now and then, a former resident will drive past the edge, spot the gold silhouette standing on the hill, and remember what was lost. All because someone opened a gate that wasn't theirs.